This week. Wait a minute. Breaking news. Wait. Apple discontinued the HomePod? Oh gosh, someone please go check on the Apple TV. And welcome to another sensational Sunday. I'm Mike, and this week we're talking about Apple officially discontinuing the original HomePod in favor of the HomePod Mini. But before we hop into this week's main story, I want to go over the comments from last week's video about Apple discontinuing the iMac Pro and kind of give my opinion on some of these comments. So Fuyu Chan has commented, honestly, I hope Apple is planning on also discontinuing the MacBook Pro 16-inch because of the M1X MacBook Pro 16-inch coming, alongside of them getting rid of the MacBook Air due to the M1 counterpart already being widely available and more popular. So basically what they're talking about is how when Apple came out with the M1 variants of the current computers, they discontinued the Intel versions of them. So if we look at the MacBook Air, which personally I got the last Intel MacBook Air, which came out early 2020, and it kind of sucked buying that computer and then having it discontinued before the end of the year. But yeah, basically they rolled out the M1 MacBook Air and they discontinued the Intel version. The 13-inch MacBook Pro, they actually did discontinue the version that the M1 MacBook Pro replaced it for the 13-inch. Because the 13-inch MacBook Pro is a little bit weird, there was technically two versions of it. There was a lower end model that had the lower end Intel processors that only had 2 USB-C ports, and then there was the higher end model that ran the higher end processors like the 16-inch MacBook Pro that had 4 USB-C ports. So the M1 version replaced the lower end version of the MacBook Pro, which that version got discontinued, the one that had 2 USB ports that had the Intel processor, but the higher end version is still available because they haven't come out with the M1X or whatever the higher end version of the M1 is going to be to replace that. So going based off of that, I will say definitely that the Intel MacBook Pro will be discontinued. The 16-inch will probably be discontinued whenever they come out with the M1 counterpart, which does suck if you like to do things like run Windows, or if you needed Windows for any reason, or if you just had specific apps that maybe only work on x86. Even though I heard the x86 emulation on Apple's platform is really good, but there are some advantages to having that Intel version of the MacBook Pro. But I definitely think that once they replace it with their own silicone, that it's going to be gone. I think it's going to be the full lineup. I think the only thing that might stick around is the Mac Pro, just because the whole point of that is to be upgradable and be able to swap out the graphics card. And I don't see Apple making like a standalone GPU or CPU just for that computer. And then also another comment from Nink just said, sick new intro, very informative video, thanks. Thank you for watching the video and for everybody who supports this channel by watching my videos. And I'll be back on Wednesday with my follow-up to the AirPods Max battery issue. And I do realize by the time that video came out that Apple released the firmware update. I still released it anyway because I still didn't know at that time if the issue was fixed. So I still went ahead and released it, and there's a lot of points in that video that aren't just specifically related to that issue, but more so how Apple's handling the issue. So I still felt like it was an important video to get out there, but I will have more to say about that on Wednesday. With all that out of the way, let's hop into today's story. So yes, Apple has come out and officially discontinued the regular HomePod, which was kind of a weird move. I was honestly surprised by this. The iMac Pro wasn't as surprising because they had already replaced it with the regular iMac. Like, they hadn't upgraded it. The regular iMac became more powerful than it, and there was really no reason to buy it, so that made sense. The HomePod, they just came out with the HomePod Mini, and I was thinking, okay, well now they're going to refresh the HomePod and probably do a cheaper version of it, because the Mini, you can tell where they cut down on some of the features, at least from the physical standpoint. Like, it doesn't have the touchscreen at the top like the regular HomePod does. Also, the volume controls are just etched on there. They're not, touchscreen buttons that appear and disappear like on the regular HomePod. So you can see where they cut corners to save money, but it sounds great, and it was only $100. So I think that the cuts they made sense. I don't think having the touchscreen on the top of the HomePod made it any better. I was excited to see what the next version of the HomePod is because I personally have a HomePod. I use it every day. And even though in my 2019 review, I did kind of tear it to shreds and recommended people not buy it unless it was under $200, which that's still true. Like, from an audio standpoint, as a standalone music speaker, is definitely the best sounding speaker in my house. Like, the original HomePod sounds amazing, but it is still overpriced for what it offers. Now let's break down what went wrong with the HomePod and why it's being discontinued. So the HomePod launched in early 2018, and immediately the first thing was it was $350, so people were already saying it was overpriced. And then on top of that, it was very limited. Like, you know, Siri is not the best assistant when it comes to the smart home stuff. So I personally think that Siri is a way better assistant than what Amazon offers. Google, I haven't used a Google Home in a few years. I guess that technically is Nest. Google was pretty good. I think Amazon's assistant, I'm not saying it because I don't want to trigger people's smart home stuff, but I think it's definitely the worst as far as it being responsive and being able to listen. Siri is one of the best. Siri doesn't get my commands wrong nearly as often as the Echoes do. But it was limited because aside from just not having as many skills available, like even now I still can't control my Logitech Harmony with my HomePod or my iPhone or anything because it's still just not available. And that's not fully Apple's fault because it's going to be up to those developers if they want to create a skill for HomeKit, but at the same time, the HomePod did so poorly, there wasn't really much incentive for them to come over and make a skill for it. So it launched, it was overpriced, it lacked the functionality that Amazon had and that Google had at the time with their assistant. The worst part was it had the ability to read out text messages and do phone calls, but the ability to detect multiple users didn't drop until 2019. So if you left that feature on, anybody could come in the house and then they would just be able to, you know, have the HomePod read your text messages out loud. So we immediately had to turn it off because I was like, there's no way without voice recognition, this feature is just useless. And unless you're like a single person living alone and never had anybody over, I think that most people just went ahead and turned it off that even, you know, bought the HomePod. So that was already a big misstep with the launch. Also, there was a small issue where the bottom of it, because it was like a rubberized material, was leaving like a ring on wood furniture. So that was an issue, and that looked extra bad considering that this was like a $350 luxury speaker. I think the biggest thing that it had going for it in the Apple ecosystem was just the fact that it was the only speaker that did Apple Music at the time. But less than a year later, support for Apple Music came to the Amazon platform. That to me made it even less valuable because at that point I was like, you can get a really nice Sonos speaker for $200 and then you can use the Echo as your assistant and then you'd be able to play Apple Music, and Sonos already supported AirPlay. So all the things that made it special were kind of gone unless you really wanted to use Siri. Again, in my opinion, it still sounds better than the $200 Sonos One speakers, but I don't think people would actually care enough to pay the extra money and technically have a less capable assistant. And also in April 2019, they already had to go ahead and cut $50 off the price because it just wasn't selling. That's a good sign that something's not selling, is when they go ahead and officially like discount it. It's something that Apple really doesn't do that often. You could say, for instance, AirPods Pro are $200 pretty much because for the most part they always sell for $200, but MSRP they're still at $250. A lot of the retailers now just sell them at a discount. It's rare that Apple actually changes the MSRP for an item, so that was an indication of how bad the HomePod was probably doing sales-wise. Now, it did pick up towards the end of 2019, but that was because there were heavy discounts for Black Friday. Like some places were selling it for $200. I mean, I got mine for around $200 because I did the same thing. I got it on a discount. But even then, if you look at the market share, they only had 4 to 5% of the market share. And that's low in comparison to everybody else on this list. That's really low, especially for a company as big as Apple. I understand it was a new speaker, but Apple's super popular and they couldn't compel people on the reasons to buy this HomePod. Another thing that really didn't happen until like the end of last year is for the longest time they only had support for Apple Music. They just started rolling in support for like Pandora and Amazon and other music services on the speaker that make it more useful, because obviously as a smart home controller, it's still not there yet. It still doesn't have the skills. It's a lot better. They've come a lot further. Like I can control about 80% of the things in my house with the HomePod, but it's still not there. It's still not 100%. There's still a lot of things that is missing. So just being able to change the default music player probably would have brought more people on board, because even though you have an iPhone, a lot of people still don't use Apple Music. Having that ability to change it probably would have brought more people in the door sooner. But they didn't. They waited until the HomePod Mini was about to come out because they knew it was going to be a way popular product, and that's when they announced the feature. Now, the biggest mistake was the marketing. Now, they spent too much time emphasizing the sound. The speaker does sound amazing. It is a really good sounding speaker, but I don't think 90% of the people really care, or especially at that time. They just wanted something to control their smart home stuff. if you're talking about that market, not really like a high-end audio speaker. So they marketed it as a smart speaker with really good sound, and that just sounds kind of like, okay, well then I don't need it. Whereas like the HomePod Mini, if you look at the advertising, they advertise the handoff thing. Like when you put your phone near it, it does the haptics. It can tell you what's playing. Like it does the intercom thing. And to me, the intercom thing was huge. I was like, okay, now that it has intercom, you can intercom with, you know, friends and family iPhone, even if you're driving or something like that. It works with CarPlay. If they're using CarPlay, you can intercom to them from a HomePod. That's infinitely more useful than anything that they ever did with the original HomePod. And it's only $100. So that's like, okay, well, I can get one for now. Add it across the room. We can all communicate with each other. They really sold us on the HomePod Mini's capability and usefulness outside of being a smart assistant, because it can barely do that. It's still not a good smart assistant, but at least they gave you some hooks. Like if you're in the Apple ecosystem, it makes sense to buy this. It's cheap enough and it sounds great. It doesn't sound amazing. It's nowhere near as good as the HomePod audio quality wise, but it's still outstanding for a speaker that size. And I don't think that most people will probably care as long as it sounds good, and it still sounds really good. So that's why they basically discontinued it. And I personally love the way the HomePod sounds. If they came out with a new HomePod, despite everything negative I said about it, I would have went ahead and bought one, because that's how good it sounds. Like if they did like a cheaper version without the touchscreen thing on the top, that was like $200. To me, that would have been the sweet spot, especially with how popular the Mini is. It's like, okay, now you can have the big one in your main room and then have the Minis around the house. I thought that's where Apple was gonna go. So honestly, I'm really surprised that they just straight up discontinued it. I did make a joke in the beginning of the video about the Apple TV, but I really am legitimately concerned about it because they haven't updated in going on 4 years now. And I really do want a new Apple TV. I was really hyped for them to do a new HomePod, and then that got discontinued. And with them adding AirPlay to newer TVs and also just coming out with an Apple TV app on multiple TVs and streaming boxes, if I had to guess on what could possibly be the next thing, I would say that it could be the Apple TV, just because I don't know if it makes sense for them to be in that space anymore. But let me know what you think. I'm bringing this video to a conclusion, but if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, and subscribe, and always do at least 2 things at the same time.